Hi there, this is Hillary with the Action Research Plus Foundation. Our work in that foundation is to raise consciousness, awareness of how action research can be helpful with various sustainability crises. And so I want to share here a talk that I just gave at the University of Oslo to folks who are quite interested in and committed to climate change transition. So my purpose really is to invite folks to know a little bit more about the action-oriented, transformative orientation to research, which I see as a very important part of the ecology of knowledge. And I'm also emphasizing more the relational aspects of action research. Action research has been around for a few decades, but emphasizing the relational aspects means really integrating subjectivity along with objectivity. So because of the emphasis indeed on subjectivity, I would like to invite folks to understand and practice with the idea that we need relational space whenever we're really engaging in action research or even talking about it, because it's relational space that really allows for learning to proceed. And so there's some intentions with that. And then the obvious question, well, what's the short answer to the question, what is action research or what is action-oriented transformations research? I use the terms a little bit interchangeably here. And I say there's really three major components to this kind of way of doing knowledge creation. Down the bottom, you see relational space. And so that's this place where there's enough trust in one another and in the space to bring our fuller selves. We don't have to necessarily like each other, but we do have to trust each other, and that's why some guidelines feels important. And then this conceptual space is pretty much what most conventional notions of knowledge creation is about. It's the sharing of ideas, insights, what does this mean, etc. So conceptual space can then really be enriched when there's a relational space in which it happens. And the whole point of that, to come to the other side of the triangle, is that we can create collaborative experiments together. So action research fundamentally is about bringing people into collaborative experiments together through the creation of relational space that leads to good conceptual space. So therefore, we can say that in the action orientation to knowledge creation, transformation is something that we create ourselves, those stakeholders who are involved in issues. It's not something we leave to experts. And so there's an emerging consciousness, an emerging response together to the complexity of now. And so this kind of learning, this kind of approach is both useful for meeting our sustainable development goals. That's the little picture of all the boxes, the colorful boxes there. Because the UN is inviting us as a global community to think, how are we going to get ourselves out of the crisis of unsustainability? And so I would suggest, with some humility, but also some confidence, that action research is one of the key ingredients in the how we're going to do that. After all, we live in a participating world. And so developing ourselves, given that our humanity is outstripped by our technology these days, can we raise consciousness, raise awareness about humanity and our capacity to learn? And so I think action research offers us a way to do that. We have to understand we're living always in an alive universe, an alive Earth. And so the idea that we can simply study things as objective, maybe it's a little bit limited. This notion of science that we've inherited from the scientific revolution, it's powerful, but it's limited because we understand now that it's not really a Newtonian universe of billiard balls clashing. What it seems to be more is a quantum kind of world, a complex world, a systems world where everything is interacting. And so while we cannot make things happen, nor define in an expert way what other people should be doing, nor do we want to simply let things happen. Climate change is really very, very frightening. But we can, as action researchers, help things happen. And what is it we're trying to help happen really is transformation. And so when we identify fundamental shifts that are necessary for our sustainable well-being and how to accomplish them, I would suggest we're involved with organizing and learning in the context of complexity. And then if we can proliferate our insights, our experiments to inform others who are up to good things, then we might be able to actually leapfrog where we currently find ourselves. So in that sense, action research is in the pragmatist tradition. We might remember names like William James and Dewey and Peirce, the great American contribution to philosophy, who've argued, well over a century ago, that action is the fruition of learning. It is not a mere afterthought. And so the contribution of action research is to help work that out, to bring methods, practices to that. And in that sense, it is a good complement and an important complement to conventional science and conventional learning, which tends to hold experience as if it is objective, which of course it is not. So let's bring this alive with a rich description, a rich case. And I know this case, I think it's one of the better cases of action research in the world currently because it's affected the lives in a positive way of 100,000 people already in Western Sweden. I know about it because I am at Chalmers University in Sweden, where my office is with these folks, and I've helped them think about the work that they are doing. And you can read more in the cookbook. We call it Cooking with Action Research, and that's available on our website. But fundamentally, there's a kind of a basic recipe, always a dangerous thing to say. It's kind of a basic recipe. You see these ingredients written on the screen there, 7 of them in most good action research in the world. And in this particular case, these ingredients started with understanding the problem that exists, a complex problem in healthcare, not just in Sweden, of course, but in all the developed nations, of aging populations and rising chronic illnesses like diabetes and illnesses like that, which are very costly. People live with them for decades. At the same time that there's a doctor shortage, the doctors and the physicians and the healthcare people in general are feeling often rather stressed, sometimes even burning out. Plus the cost is going through the roof. In other words, this is what some people would call a wicked problem. It's a mess. How on earth does one intervene? And so the action research orientation was seen as very useful. And very briefly, we can say that key stakeholders in this was a physician, Svante Lifagren, started out with an MD and then actually did his PhD in action research as he got more and more positively inclined towards this way of doing research. And he met with his colleagues, partly during his PhD process, so with engineers, with management consultants, and began to ask himself about his own patients. So how could he involve his own patients' experience, given that at least a few of them were saying to him, hey, Svante, it would be so much better if healthcare could take care of us before we have to actually go into the hospital. Going into the clinic when we are most sick is the worst possible thing to ask of us. So that's kind of an aha for Svante, a man who cared a lot about his patients. And so, to cut a long story short, and I do encourage you to read about it, he invited healthcare workers to meet with patients in a kind of a learning orientation, a learning platform. And these kinds of platforms are necessary in all action research so that we can learn together. Remember what I was saying about relational space. Well, this is an example of creating relational space so that people can come together. And so in that sense, bringing patients together with their physicians, with their nurses, with other stakeholders, what is happening is people can begin to talk, share their own experience, and then ask themselves, what would be a good idea here? How could we make things better? What might be some experiments that we could try? So this learning platform is really a space where people can come together, research what they're doing, bring up good ideas, and then systematically track whatever experiments they're trying to do. So that may sound a little abstract, but these pictures begin to convey what that started to look like. The picture at the top, this is a learning platform, literally where people met around tables. This is a particularly large one that included some politicians from Sweden. In the beginning, it was a smaller group of people meeting around patients. But some of the experiments that they started was, for example, how do we have mobile teams go out to the patients? This, after all, was the idea that was coming from Svanti's patients. Instead of them coming to the clinic, what if mobile teams could go to the patient? It's not rocket science, but you might imagine that there's a huge amount of work that needs to happen there for people to agree that, okay, that is a good idea. It's not unsafe to do that. Yes, it might be possible. Can we begin a small experiment and then look at the numbers? Are we saving money? Are we saving lives? To see all those things. And indeed, it turned out that by keeping people out of the clinics, they were saving a rather large amount of money. For example, every time a nurse could go to a patient's house, it saved almost 90% of the cost of bringing the patient into the clinic. Mostly because once a patient comes into the clinic, it's often the case that they end up having to get a lot of tests, and they may even end up in the clinic for longer. So somehow sending the nurse out to the patient turns out to be better for all concerned. That went so well that other kind of efforts to get into preventive care then began to grow. And so there's a picture there of working with the immigrant and refugee populations to bring cancer screening into immigrant populations, thus saving money further down the road. So emphasis on going to the patient, meeting the patient where they are. So if those are some of the basic practices, which remember is all about learning and experimentation, then we might ask ourselves, well, what might be some of the implications of this way of doing knowledge for climate change? And so, of course, there are also good examples of action research in the climate change world. I have two pictures here. One is of the work in the Yucatan, which is bordered by the Atlantic Ocean. And as the ocean heats up and sea levels rise, there's just more of a concern for flooding. And so this work by colleagues Terry Castillo and Fede Dickinson, associated with an action research think tank in the Yucatan, their effort was to go into communities and work with people to consider what climate resilience might look like for them. And you can't beat a hurricane, but what you can do is raise your houses off the earth. At least that was people's insights when they first started working together. Again, not rocket science, but really rather brilliant. And it takes a lot of work inside communities to accept this kind of huge change to their tradition of what houses normally look like. And how do we work together? And can women have a voice in what has heretofore been a rather patriarchal structure? So all these kinds of things get mixed in the mix, if you will, as action research learning begins to happen, because it's creating a relational space. People can share good ideas, and then moving into experiment together, but continuing to go in a kind of a spiral of learning where there's more learning, and it actually creates more resilience in the human learning system itself as people are developing and growing themselves as agents of change. Another example from colleagues starting in the Boston area, led by Grady McGonigal, who decided that out of his practice of organization development, he was going to redirect all his efforts to convening elders, fellow elders in climate change. And that work has since developed to becoming also politically oriented and getting out the vote and all sorts of good things. So work starts, and then experiments often begin to grow as the learning cycle grows. And so it leads us to ask, perhaps provocative, but I hope encouraging question, which is, what would it actually be like if we began to devote more of our funds, let's say 50%, I'd be happy with 5%, that is currently used simply to describe our many problems, like we can describe the rising seas and the ferocity of hurricanes, Or we could actually put some of that money towards supporting action-oriented transformative efforts. That to me seems like a good way to go. In this sense, action research is a paradigm of knowledge which is about transforming. People transforming as they learn more together, and therefore it is a transformation itself of our notion of what knowledge creation is. Generally speaking, I think people continue to believe, fairly naturally, that the scientific method and the scientific approach, called empiricism or rationalism, is the only way or the best way to do knowledge creation. It is, in fact, a very powerful way, of course, but is coming under question as postmodernism advances, and we really ask, what is the purpose of knowledge? Can only the expert have a view? No, indeed, there are now multiple perspectives that need to be valued, and action researchers kind of climb on top of that. They piggyback on that and say, well, we also need to have a change agenda that's explicit, because most people have a change agenda that may be quite implicit, and therefore we are more honest, we are more transparent if we acknowledge what our change agenda is. And inside of that, evidence and different kinds of evidence comes into question. And who really has voice? Is it just the observer, or is it also the very stakeholders who are themselves involved? What's the time horizon? Should it only be the past? Remember, most objective knowledge is about the past. We would suggest that we can also form the future forming, Ken Gergen's term, as we are engaging in these kinds of learning platforms. So what makes this unusual is the emphasis on integrating subjectivity and reflexivity. That's when we begin to take seriously, what are my biases and how do I make those more explicit? So I would suggest that it's an advance in the knowledge ecology because it calls for the development of the researcher and the people that the researchers research with. So this issue of development then lends itself to a conversation about the stages of human development. And that's its own body of literature. I'm not going to spend enormous amounts of time here, but suffice it to say that the move from a rather black-white kind of expert view of the world to one that is more self-critically nuanced, along with the ability to perform tasks together, to find solidarity and not just be individualistically oriented with knowledge, to find solidarity is itself a kind of developmental moment, a developmental move that's of great importance. And the work here that is important goes all the way back to Mark Baldwin, to Jean Piaget, to people like Kohlberg, who suggested that there are stages of development, and most of us don't know even about these stages after we leave school. After the age of 18, we feel, oh, okay, I'm done, my learning is done. But no, in fact, there are currently 5 schools of thought, all of whom find that the stages can continue, and we might suggest it's best if they do continue after we leave school. It's not so much about the content, but the very knowledge that is developing. After all, we don't want to remain with that 5-year-old energy of it's all about me, these early energies, or where we just want to fit in with the crowd. But in fact, some of us can mature, and an effort to mature ourselves can indeed lead to awareness of those places where we have some kind of shadow, right? Those kinds of things where we do not feel that we can collaborate that well with others for all sorts of reasons. So becoming aware of these shadow places can often help release ourselves from old boundaries, which in turn allows us to be more growthful with others and indeed with ourselves. In a way, then, we're kind of bringing our capacity for mutual power, and rather than just power over, where an individual may have an answer and simply tell others to do it. But no, there's a mutual power because there's a mutual inquiry. And so relational creativity can kind of take off from that. I use the language here of Bill Torbert because I think his notions of naming these stages that many, many people have found to exist, his naming these stages helps us see that conventional knowledge creation resides more at the expert level, where there's a sense of There's an expert distant from reality who can kind of announce, this is what's true. And even if that were helpful, and sometimes, of course, it's very helpful to know what's true, most people don't just jump on board and say, oh yeah, great, I'm going to do what the expert told me. In fact, people need to bring their own sense of themselves and their own experience to this kind of knowledge creation. And so on this slide, it's kind of a reworking of the James notion of pragmatism that David Kolb, I think, really brought alive with Kolb's notion of experiential learning, but that we start with our own experience. We can't get there from anywhere other than here, as Paulo Freire reminded us. And so action research transformations inquiry starts with the experience of stakeholders, including the researchers themselves. And therefore, out of that, we can develop our capacity to take action. And that action requires reflection on experience and also analysis. This is bringing in of expert data, bringing in models that can be useful to us so that we can decide together how to initiate an experiment together. And this fundamentally is the basic notion of the people's turn, the democratic turn that I believe has enriched the scientific method that started all the way back in the 50s already. And I love this quote by Dr. Marja-Liisa Swans, a Finnish woman, who kind of puts it in terms that I think we all can understand the application to climate change, helping people to see their own problems, not just to ignore our problems, but to actually see them, but not telling them this is your problem, but offering a space, a relational space in which people can work together to become active. And so out of this notion of action research, what I would suggest what's actually happening is that there's really key dialectics that are coming in now for collective learning. We're adding personal experience back into sense making. So it's not just these dry expert models, which are important, but they're rather dry. They don't motivate action. But bringing personal experience to that together brings a kind of a dynamism. I use yin yang, or we could use infinity signs, that there's a polarity between our own experience and the sense-making models of others and those that we can create ourselves. And there's also a very important dialectic between experiments and observations, that in designing experiment, we're doing that as a result of what we're observing and talking about together. So again, there's this infinity sign, this polarity loop between observation and experiment. So bringing these things together helps develop us beyond just the expert notion of what knowledge is, so that we can work together. The rest of my talk really only makes sense in the room where we were doing it. It invites people to look more carefully at their own experience. After all, to quote again from Freire, you can't get there from there. You get there from here. So looking at our own experience, and first of all, just asking people to identify what is kind of a focal experience right now. What are you feeling? And if we listen to Nielsen's Symphony, The Four Temperaments, it gives us a hint that feelings, emotions, are based on kind of four basic types. We're either glad, mad, sad, or angry. And so starting there, we can then add in what else is happening for us in experience and bring awareness to our own intentions, our sensations, our thoughts, and our behaving. And so the practice that I introduce here to bring alive for people in their own experience what action research can be is to begin to look at the four territories of experience, where people can begin to choose what thoughts they want to be aware of and to look at more carefully, what behaviors, what sensations, what intentions. And so in this presentation, people were invited to look carefully at what they are aware of and what they realized they were not aware of in a particularly important learning moment. And so I complete here by saying, by inviting more of a natural dynamism back into our collaborative learning, we can truly help with climate change transitions. Because fundamentally, what action research is about is co-producing knowledge. But to co-produce knowledge requires an awareness and a practice with a couple of dialectics. The first is to bring back our concepts with our experience, because experience is really the cradle, the initiation, the catalyst for learning. Concepts without being enriched by personal experience are a little too dry. But in addition to that, there's another dialectic, which is bringing together reflection with experiment, because only reflecting, as most conventional science is about, only reflecting without connecting to experiment leaves us again feeling a little too passive, overwhelmed by knowledge, but not necessarily able to do anything with it. And so only speaking without doing is not what action research is about. And so we, in this way, bring together two very important environments. The external world, which is really the world of results and empiricism and all of that, which I think the scientific method helps us very much to investigate and become active in. But as importantly, almost never spoken about, however, in our scientific tradition, is internal experience, our sense of purpose, intention, emotions, subjective states. And so part of the suggestion here is that subjectivity can also be measured. We can become aware of it and become able to talk about it. And in talking about it, we can also become more active together in collaborating, in creating experiments from which we can learn.